Hello, Genevieve. Welcome, everybody, to our special guest speaker today, Madison Walsh. She's joining us from Health Promotions, and she is a registered dietitian. So we know that her presentation today on heart-healthy eating is going to be on point. We're going to learn a lot today, and we're going to be challenged to clean up our eating a little bit to make sure that our heart stays working well into our later years. So Madison, I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I think I will just turn my video on briefly so that you can all put a face to the name. So let me know if that's working, if you can see me.
You look great.
Yes, okay, great, wonderful. So hi everyone, my name is Madison Walsh. Thanks so much for the quick introduction there. I'm super happy to be joining you from here in Halifax. So I am a health promotion specialist with the health promotion team here in Halifax. We do all sorts of health presentations like this one. We run a lot of health courses for the military members here on base. And this is actually my first time doing something related to OutCan, so I'm really happy to be here and speaking to all of you. I know we've got some participants from all over the world, I was told, so that's pretty cool. I'm really excited to be able to have some discussions with you all today. So the topic of discussion, of focus for us today will be heart-healthy eating. They did mention just now that I am a registered dietitian, and I have been one for almost 2 years now. So hopefully you'll find what I have to say informative and relevant. We'll talk really to the basics, so I don't want to overwhelm you, but just sort of go over some of the best and most evidenced things that you can do to support the health of your heart when it comes to what you're eating and your diet. I also do have a Master's of Public Health that I completed at the University of Toronto a couple years back, which was a great addition to my education, and I really learned a lot about kind of population health as a whole rather than just the clinical side of dietetics. So I have kind of a background in both, which makes it really interesting. So that's just a little bit about me. I probably will turn my video off now just so that we can all focus on the presentation. Perhaps it makes it a little more visible for you all. And I can always turn it back on to answer any questions later at the end. If you do have any questions throughout my presentation, feel free to put them in the chat at any time. I know Joanne said she would, sorry, is it Joanne? Joanne, I think, said that she would monitor the chat for me, so I'll keep an eye on it. But if you have any questions, she'll let me know if there's anything in there, and I'm happy to answer them as we go along. So we will certainly be doing that. All right, so I'm going to switch the video off here. And we're going to get started. So I want to just jump right in quickly to make sure that we're all on the same page with what we're talking about when we are speaking of heart health or heart disease. The more formal term for heart disease is cardiovascular disease. That just talks about cardio being your heart and vascular being the system of blood vessels in your body, and the disease of those two things together. So cardiovascular disease occurs when there is a reduced blood flow to your heart. This type of disease affects approximately 2.4 million Canadian adults, which is approximately 8.9%, so it is a pretty significant issue, and it's been found to be the second leading cause of death in Canada. So it's definitely something of focus for dietitians, for doctors, nurses. It's you know, worthy of concern, certainly, and something that actually there is a lot that can be done in order to improve the health of your heart at the individual level, which is why this is such a great conversation for us to have today, because there are things that you can do to empower yourself to make improvements starting today to your heart health. It doesn't have to be some big scary thing. There's lots of different very simple tips that you can take home with you today to improve your heart health and to reduce the risk of you coming down with cardiovascular disease in the future. So we'll go to the next slide here. These are kind of just a summary of some of the many different ways that you can reduce your risk for cardiovascular disease. There are lots of different ways, and these are kind of the main categories. So of course we have nutrition. So following a balanced diet, and we're going to talk mostly about that particular method of reducing your risk today, but I do just want to touch on the other ones so that you understand that it's a very holistic approach. So we also have exercise. If you exercise regularly, the more often, really the better in this case. That can really play a role in improving your heart health. Reducing or limiting alcohol intake as much as possible. If you do choose to drink, then following the low-risk drinking guidelines would be a good place to start, and those are available for on the Canadian, online for the Canadian guidelines. Smoking, of course, the best recommendation there is not to smoke at all. If you are a smoker, then of course reducing your smoking or eventually quitting would be the goal there. The less that you smoke, the better for your heart. Stress management is another big one. Stress plays a fairly significant role in blood pressure. Blood pressure plays a big role in heart health. So by managing our stress, we can help to manage our blood pressure and therefore help to reduce our risk of cardiovascular disease. And lastly, getting lots of good sleep, which I know some people can really struggle with, and that can be a very personal thing, but aiming for somewhere between 7 to 9 hours a night is the recommendation. Of course, that may not apply to everyone. You know, there's lots of reasons why individuals struggle to get that much sleep, but trying to follow as balanced of a sleep schedule as possible and get that 7 to 9 hours whenever possible is a really good way to improve your overall health and also your heart health. So today, as I said, we will really focus mainly only on the nutrition piece, but I wanted you to have an understanding that there are so many other things that go together with nutrition in order to reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease. And the other thing that I really want to stress is that small changes really do add up. So we're going to go through some, fairly simple, small steps. You don't have to do all of them. Really, even just choosing one to start out with of what we talk about today and going forward with that can make a substantial difference in the health of your heart and your overall health. So don't feel too overwhelmed. These are just some suggestions, and anything that you can do to go along with some of these suggestions will make an impact. So these are the 4 key tips that I want to talk a little bit about in more depth today. So we'll start off with talking about following Canada's food guide and what overall balanced eating looks like and how that plays a role in our heart health. We will then look into the world of fat and focusing on which fats are perhaps better for our heart health than others. Next, we'll move on to eating fiber and the role that fiber plays in the health of your heart. And lastly, of course, one that I think we're all quite familiar with, which is salt or sodium, and the role that that has and the importance of trying to limit our intake of salt. So those are the 4 key areas that we'll be discussing today. So starting out, we want to touch a little bit on just general healthy eating, which is really, well summarized by Canada's Food Guide. So following Canada's Food Guide is a way to provide your body with the nutrients that it needs to function, and it's a really great place to start when aiming to lower your risk of heart disease. So this is the updated food guide from 2019, fairly recent, and it really focuses on proportions of food rather than portions and portion sizes. So as you can see, the plate on the food guide has been divided into kind of 3 sections. Half of the plate is recommended to be filled with fruits and vegetables. The other half is divided into 2 quarters, 1 quarter with protein foods and 1 quarter with whole grain foods. And then, of course, making water your drink of choice whenever possible. So by following this Canada's Food Guide, we can generally achieve a fairly balanced diet where we consume a wide variety of foods, and those foods provide us a variety of both macronutrients and micronutrients. And all of these types of nutrients that we get in all types of foods, they all have their own characteristics, which are essential to various body functions. And these all play really important roles in maintaining our heart health. So when we think about what healthy eating really is and what that means on a broader level, it really does break down to what's represented in Canada's Food Guide. So nutritious foods are really the foundation for healthy eating, and that includes vegetables and fruit, whole grains, and protein foods, which should be consumed regularly, ideally in the proportions of Canada's Food Guide recommendations. Within the category of protein foods, the recommendation is to consume plant-based proteins more often than animal-based proteins, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that is and some of the benefits of plant-based protein a little bit later, but certainly there's lots of them, and as much as possible, it's a really great idea to include plant-based proteins, even if you are not a vegetarian or vegan. Water, of course, should be the beverage of choice, as I mentioned, and nutritious food can also be fresh, frozen, canned, or dried. There's really no one best way. It's all about just getting those foods, the fruits and vegetables, the whole grains, and the protein foods. And however, whatever, you know, I think someone's mic might have been on. Okay, great. Okay, perfect. You know, the way that the food is packaged doesn't necessarily matter as long as you're making sure there's no, you know, excessive amounts of added ingredients like sugars or salts to your canned goods, for example. That part aside, as long as, you know, you're still getting the whole food, it really shouldn't make a difference if it's fresh, frozen, canned, or dried. You're still getting all of the nutrients, and there's still really great choices. Some are going to be more affordable or more accessible, so it's good, I think, to point out that whatever method you choose to eat these foods is perfectly acceptable. So that's my little tidbit on general healthy eating. And now we're going to go a little bit further into some of the other recommendations. So we're going to focus on fat, first of all, and we are going to take a little bit of a dive into some of the science behind fat and how that has an impact on your heart health. So I'm going to try to keep it fairly general. If you do have any questions along the way, please do feel free to ask. So before we talk too much about fat or the different types of fat, we first need to understand what cholesterol is. And this is something that I think a lot of people can be confused about. So I'd really like to touch on this first before diving too deep into the different types of fat. So cholesterol is basically, at its core, it's just a waxy fat-like substance, and it is needed in the body to function. It's used for building blocks for hormones, bile acid that's used in digestion, and for the creation of vitamin C, which we get from the sun and then convert to vitamin C. Cholesterol plays a role in that as well. Or sorry, vitamin D, not vitamin C, of course. The sunshine vitamin, vitamin D. So cholesterol plays a role in that process. So it is a very important substance to have in our body. It's made by all animal cells, and it is an essential component of all cell structure in animal cells. So any animal, including ourselves, create cholesterol in our bodies. So that means that some food is a natural source of cholesterol. For example, eggs are known to be a very common source of cholesterol that's talked about a lot. But the good news is that foods that do contain cholesterol actually do not significantly affect your blood cholesterol levels. So they won't have a huge impact on those levels when you get the test, you know, done by your doctor and they tell you your cholesterol levels. The cholesterol that you take in through food is really not going to impact that very much. What does play a role more significantly in your cholesterol levels in your blood are triglycerides. So triglycerides are actually converted to cholesterol in the body, and this does affect your blood cholesterol. So this is where we want to, and that is sort of what leads us into the discussion about fat. So LDL and HDL cholesterol are often words that are thrown around, but I think it's important to mention that LDL and HDL are actually not cholesterol in themselves. What they are lipoproteins that carry cholesterol throughout the body. So they are not in and of themselves cholesterol. They're basically little vehicles for cholesterol to be moved around throughout your body. So the LDL is known as, I guess, the bad or the lousy cholesterol. If you need a way to remember it, we usually say L is lousy and H is healthy. So LDL is the lesser of the two, because this one is the one that carries cholesterol throughout your body and deposits it in your body's cells. And so that then causes an increase in your blood cholesterol levels and increases your risk for heart disease. On the other hand, HDL carries cholesterol by absorbing it and taking it back to the liver for it to be removed and flushed out from the body. So that helps to decrease your level of overall cholesterol in the body, and then generally decreases the risk of heart disease as well. So we want to have an increased level of HDL and a decreased level of LDL. So that's just a little bit of background on cholesterol and LDL and HDL. Hopefully that makes sense. Feel free to ask any questions if you have them. But that is, I think, a really important part to understand before we talk too much more about heart disease and the role that fat has. Another topic that I want to touch quickly on is atherosclerosis, which is a big fancy word for heart disease or cardiovascular disease. And it basically just implies the buildup of plaque on the inside of your blood vessels. So if you do have high levels of cholesterol in your body as a result of having higher levels of the LDL lipoprotein, the cholesterol can build up on the walls of your blood vessels, and this is what we more commonly call plaque. So the plaque, or the buildup of that cholesterol on your vessels, causes the blood vessels to narrow and therefore limits the blood flow to all of the cells of our body. And this is what can eventually result in either a heart attack, which means that the heart is not getting enough blood, or a stroke, which means that the brain is not getting enough blood. So this is what it looks like in a diagram here. As you can see on the left-hand side, we have a perfectly healthy blood vessel where the blood is flowing through. And as we progress to the right, we get an increased buildup of plaque to the point where very little blood can actually pass through the vessel. And at that extreme case, that's when we might see heart attacks and strokes occur as a result of that buildup of cholesterol. Okay, so now that we've done that, I'd like to talk a little bit about the different types of fat. So fat can be divided up in really three categories. The first one that I want to talk about is called trans fat. So trans fat is actually a man-made, essentially a man-made type of fat. So it basically is us having taken liquid oil and changed them into a solid fat. This was used to make things more convenient. We wanted to have the ability to have your liquid oils in a solid form to make food taste good and have it, you know, add to these types of commercially baked goods, fried foods, and processed foods. Unfortunately, this type of fat has been discovered to actually be quite harmful to our health. So it does two things that are really not so good in our bodies. It increases the LDL lipoprotein, or LDL cholesterol as it's more commonly known, which obviously is the bad one, and that will lead to a buildup of cholesterol in our blood vessels. It also decreases the HDL, or the good lipoprotein, which leads to less of that good lipoprotein removing the cholesterol. So not only do we have an increased buildup of cholesterol because of the increased LDL, but we also have less HDL removing the cholesterol. So we are going to see quite a buildup of cholesterol in our blood vessels. As I said, this is mostly man-made, although it is natural in some foods in very small amounts, like dairy and meat, but the amounts are so insignificant that it really is not important in those foods. It's really an issue in the foods that it's been added to, and the man-made version that's added to those types of processed foods that I mentioned. So really this one is one that we want to avoid altogether. It's not necessary because it's man-made. There's really no need for us to consume it. It has absolutely no beneficial function in our body. Yes, it does make food taste good, but that's pretty well it. The good news is that in Canada, although I know that not you folks are not in Canada currently, but in Canada it has been banned as of September 2018. So Health Canada made the decision that it can no longer be added to our foods because of the detrimental effects that it has on our heart. If you live in another country, I'm not sure of where you all are, and I'm not sure of their specific regulations. It's certainly something that you could look up on your own to see if it is still allowed to be added to food, or you can just check nutrition labels on the back. It will tell you if there's trans fat in a certain type of food. And like I said, the ones to look out for are those commercially baked foods, fried foods, and processed foods. So take a look at the nutrition label maybe next time you're in the store, depending on what country you are currently in. But thankfully here in Canada, it's really not something we need to worry about anymore because of the fact that it has been banned for us. So Health Canada is really looking out for our best interests on that one. The next fat that we're going to talk about is saturated fat. So saturated fat mainly comes from animal sources, although there are other ways that we can gain saturated fat through some plant sources. So really any meat, dairy products, coconut oil, palm oil, and lard are some of the most significant sources of saturated fat. And this one is known to kind of be in the middle. So obviously we know trans fat is quite detrimental, and that's why we've banned it in Canada. Saturated fat is not quite as bad for our health, but it still has some potential negative effects. And those effects are that it increases the LDL lipoprotein, the bad cholesterol. So that means that we're seeing an increase in our blood cholesterol as a result of saturated fat. It is solid at room temperature, so that's the easy way to tell whether or not it's saturated fat. So for example, with coconut oil, if you've ever kept it in your cupboard at room temperature, so maybe not in the summertime, but hovering around 20, 21 degrees, it will be fairly solid in its tub, as opposed to olive oil, which is liquid in the jar. So that's a good way to tell if something is a saturated fat. So of course, if we're seeing increased LDL, then that's going to increase our risk for heart disease if it's consumed in large amounts. It won't make a huge significant impact on your risk for heart disease if you're just eating it semi-regularly and in moderate amounts. But if all you ate was steak every single day, then that could be something to be a little bit more concerned about. So it's sort of one of those ones that, certainly okay to eat, but just make sure it's in moderation and just watch out for your intake. But every now and then certainly shouldn't have too much of an impact on your health. And then the last type of fat that we want to talk about is unsaturated fat, the third category. So this type of fat has some really positive impacts on our health, especially our heart health. And I think that fat in general gets a fairly bad rap when it comes to health, but we often forget that this guy, the unsaturated fat, is actually really good for us, and we certainly want to include this type. So we cannot call all fat bad because this one has some really great effects. So what it does is it increases the HDL, the high density lipoprotein, which has positive impacts on decreasing our blood cholesterol. And sometimes, in some cases, in certain types of unsaturated fat, it also decreases the LDL, or the bad lipoprotein, which has positive impacts on our cholesterol because we're seeing less cholesterol be deposited in our vessels. So this type of fat is generally liquid at room temperature, and sources include oils, any type of vegetable oil other than the few that I named on the last slide. Fish, any fatty fish is a great source of unsaturated fat. Avocados are a very popular source of unsaturated fat, including avocado oil, which is the oil extracted from the avocado, and nuts and seeds. So just to keep in mind, of course, we all know that a nut or a seed or an avocado is not liquid at room temperature. The food itself may not be, but the oil is. So when it's extracted from the food, we do find a liquid fat, but it's dispersed throughout the food, so you can't see that it's liquid. But if you look at avocado oil or almond oil, for example, those would all be liquids at room temperature. So this is definitely the healthiest type of fat and does have some benefits in increasing cardiovascular health and decreasing your risk of heart disease. So we certainly want to include this type of fat in our diet. Up next, I want to show you a little chart that I find particularly useful that shows different types of fats and how they are made up with the combination of saturated and unsaturated fat as well as trans fat. Of course, this is an older graph, and now trans fat is banned in Canada, so things look a little bit different. So for example, I want to draw your attention to the hard margarine, which right now is showing it has 31% trans fat. That is no longer the case here in Canada. It may be elsewhere, but not here, because we have now banned the use of margarine. It used to be that that was how margarine was made, was by creating trans fat, but now we have other ways. So while only using unsaturated fat. So it is a perfectly healthy option to include in your diet because it does not contain trans fat in Canada. And as you can see, each different oil has different percentages. So as I mentioned, saturated fat mostly comes from animal sources, but you can see that there are some types of oils, in fact most have at least a little bit of the saturated fat. However, they generally are mainly comprised of the unsaturated fat. And you will see that there's two types. There's polyunsaturated and monounsaturated. We won't really get into the difference between those two. It's just the chemical structure. They both are unsaturated fat, and they both have positive impacts on your heart health. So that's really the important part to know there. So hopefully that helps a little bit. It kind of shows you which types of oils have the higher rates of unsaturated fat, and those ones would be probably the better choices when you're selecting oils for your cooking. So again, just to reiterate, we certainly want to focus on consuming foods with unsaturated fat as opposed to saturated or trans fat when we're thinking about our heart health, and these are the key foods that would contain unsaturated fat. So that would include fish, fatty fish like salmon, rainbow trout, herring, tuna, vegetable oils, so any oil made from a vegetable other than few like coconut oil or palm oil that I mentioned that do have saturated fat high amounts. So things like olive oil, avocado oil, whatever it is that you choose to cook with. Non-hydrogenated margarine, as well as nuts and seeds, and of course avocado. So these are some of the most popular ways to make sure that you're getting your intake of unsaturated fats, and focusing on these sources is a good way to protect your heart health and reduce your risk of heart disease, while also watching our intake of the other types of fats that are a little bit more damaging when it comes to your heart health.
Madison?
Yes.
We do have a question in the chat that came up, and I thought I'm interrupting because I think it goes well with what you were just talking about.
Okay, sure.
The question is, can you talk about plant-based butter? Is it like margarine, and is it a better choice as opposed to real butter?
Okay, interesting. So I'm not exactly sure what they're talking about when they say plant-based butter. To me, that I'm thinking that that would be margarine. Are they able to clarify a little bit? Is there a specific brand that they use that I could? I'm not aware.
You can either unmute yourself and ask, or you can type it in the chat. Vegan butter.
Vegan butter, okay. So my knowledge of that is that it is also made from oil, so it really would fall in the same category, at least to my knowledge, as margarine. It may not be exactly the same, or it may not have the exact same method of being created, but it's basically just a non-dairy substitute that's made by combining whatever oil it is that they choose to use with water and other oils perhaps together, and making that into kind of an emulsified buttery tasting thing. So in my mind, that is certainly very similar to margarine. However, margarine may still contain small amounts of dairy, which is perhaps why it's advertised as vegan butter as opposed to margarine. If you're looking to have no dairy, then that would be a good choice for you if you know that your margarine maybe has dairy in it. I think some brands do, and some maybe do not. So that's, I think, the main difference between vegan butter and margarine. Both are certainly heart healthy options. And the question about whether it's better than butter is an age-old question, and it's one that's a bit tricky to answer. If you're looking at the facts about heart health, then the direct answer would be yes, margarine and vegan butter are technically a little bit better for heart health because of the fact that they are made with unsaturated fats, that being oils, plant oils. Whereas butter is made from dairy, which is an animal source, and it does contain saturated fat, which is that in-between one that we talked about that comes from meats and dairy and those types of things. So if you are highly concerned about your heart health, then the technical answer is yes, margarine is a better choice. That being said, personally, I definitely enjoy the taste of butter, and I know a lot of people feel that way as well. It's a little bit more flavorful and does have certain uses where it really does make a great choice. So again, it often comes down to moderation and making personal choices. So I wouldn't say, cut the butter out completely. It depends on what your priorities are. And, if you're baking something and you really want to use butter, or if you strongly prefer butter on your toast, I certainly don't see a problem with that. It's all about how much you're consuming. So I hope that answers your question a little bit. And I think we'll move on, but certainly feel free to ask any follow-ups as well if you have any. So here we have the general guidelines from Health Canada with respect to fat and our consumption of it. So the idea is that we should aim for 6 grams or less of total fat per day. But the ones that I really like to highlight are limiting the saturated and trans to 20 grams or less. So personally, if you're consuming all unsaturated fat, then I'm not too worried about how much. It's mainly limiting the saturated and trans amount. So in Canada, that's really easy with trans fats because we don't have any, but mainly limiting the saturated fat to less than 20 grams a day if possible. And then that is generally 3 to 6 teaspoons of healthy fat per day, so focusing on unsaturated fat being at least 3 to 6 teaspoons. Keeping in mind that that doesn't mean that it's completely added to your foods. Some of that comes naturally in the food. So if you're eating nuts and seeds, or if you're eating fish, salmon, etc., then some of those teaspoons are coming from those foods. So it's not that you have to add 6 teaspoons of olive oil to everything you eat. That's kind of an over the day throughout all of your food sources type of recommendation. And then we talk about choosing lower fat. So the Canadian guidelines do say to aim for 20 grams or less of saturated and 2 grams or less of saturated and trans fat in a particular product. So this is like if you're looking on a label and it's in that one product, the recommendation would be 2 grams or less. 3 grams or less of fat per serving is the recommendation. Again, I'm more focused on the saturated and trans because of the fact that unsaturated does have so many great benefits. So unless you're worried about calorie intake, then there's really no reason to limit your unsaturated fat intake. It's mainly about the saturated and trans and keeping that under 2 grams. And then the other recommendation that they give is on the percent daily value, so the percents that are on those labels. You should generally aim for 8% or less per serving, and that is of overall fat. So again, I think the key one, and that's why I've bolded it here, is to look at how much saturated or trans fat the product has and try to keep that below 2 grams whenever possible as a heart-healthy choice. Okay, so that concludes fat, unless there's any other questions. And if there are more, we can certainly address them at the end as well. But I think we will move on now to fiber. So fiber definitely has a very important role to play when it comes to your heart health, and we're going to learn about why. So first I want to talk a little bit about what fiber is. So fiber is a type of carbohydrate. There are 3 categories of carbohydrate. We have sugar, which I think we're all very familiar with, that serves to make food sweet. It can be either naturally occurring or added to products, and it has an impact on our blood sugar levels. So it actually increases the glucose in our body, in our blood, and has that impact on our levels. This is known as the simple type of carbohydrate because it's made of small molecules of sugar rather than complex, which are the other 2. So the other 2 complex types of carbohydrate include starch and fiber. So starch is found in your grains, vegetables, and legumes. So often people refer to, for example, potatoes as being a source of starch. That's absolutely correct, but it also is found in all types of grains, other vegetables, and legumes like beans, peas, lentils. This type of starch also does have an impact in your blood sugar levels because although it is a more complex molecule, once you digest it, it is broken down into your body and it becomes a simple sugar. So it still has that same impact on your blood sugar levels as regular simple sugar would have because it is broken down through that digestion system. And lastly, we have fiber, which is another type of complex carbohydrate. This one passes through your system without being digested. So it is, unlike the other 2 types of carbohydrates, indigestible. So we do not gain calories from it, we do not gain really much nutrient from it, but it does provide some really important health benefits. There are 2 types of fiber, which we'll talk a little about in a moment here, which are soluble and insoluble. There are many health benefits to consuming fiber, and because this is indigestible, it does not raise our blood sugar levels, which is a really good benefit of consuming fiber. It helps to reduce, in some cases, the levels of our blood sugar, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. So here we have a breakdown of the two types of fiber. We have insoluble and soluble. So insoluble fiber is known to not dissolve in water and helps to keep your bowels regular. So that's really the main, positive impact of insoluble fiber. Is, it helps keep you regular throughout the day, prevents constipation, and it is found in lots of different vegetables and fruit. It's found in whole grains and wheat bran. The one that's more relevant to what we're talking about today is soluble fiber. This one is known to dissolve in water. So if you take, the actual fiber out of the food and stir it around, it would dissolve, and it helps to lower your cholesterol and blood glucose. So those are kind of the two ways that this type of fiber has an impact on the health of your heart. Soluble fiber is found in some fruits like apples and oranges, vegetables like carrots and eggplants, oats, barley, psyllium husk, and legumes. Lots of great ways that we can consume this type of fiber. So I just want to focus for a second on the grain part of fiber. So all grains contain fiber. Some have insoluble, some have soluble, some may have both. But I just want to point out the difference between what whole grain and white grain actually means, because surprisingly not a lot of people necessarily know this. So when we're looking at any grain, whether that's wheat grain, oats grain, wheat bran, whatever type of grain it is that you're purchasing at the store, the grain is comprised of 3 different layers. So on the outside we have the bran, on the inside we have the endosperm, and in the middle of the endosperm we have the germ. The bran is the fiber-rich outer layer that's quite tough and helps to protect the seed from damage and contains lots of great healthy vitamins and minerals. The endosperm is a softer middle layer that contains mostly just carbohydrates along with a little bit of protein. And it is a sort of starchy carbohydrate that you would get from this endosperm. And then in the middle, we have the germ, which is the smaller, very rich in nutrient core that contains a wide variety of antioxidants like vitamin E. It has B vitamins and some healthy fats in there, so some unsaturated fats. So if you look over on the right-hand side, when we buy white bread or any type of white grain, you can see that they've actually removed the 2 best parts of the grain. So they take off the bran, which is the one that has the fiber, and they take out the germ, which is the one that contains really most of the nutrients and the healthy fat. And what you're left with is basically just carbohydrate, which then is turned into sugar in your body and will have an impact on your blood sugar levels. So that's kind of the science behind the difference between whole grain and white grain. And these whole grain products are obviously the better choice if you are, concerned about your heart health or your health in general. It's definitely going to provide you with more benefits than the white grain. So in terms of foods containing fiber, of course we do have whole grains, not white grains, fruits and vegetables of a wide variety, legumes, as well as nuts and seeds. In terms of soluble fiber, which is the one that has impacts on our heart health, this one is mostly found in whole grains like oats and barley, fruits and vegetables, legumes, and as I mentioned, psyllium husk, which is the husk of a seed of an herb that's mainly grown in India and is a really popular way to get soluble fiber. You can usually get it at Bulk Barn in bulk in a bag, and you can add it to any type of food, sprinkle it on top. It's a great way to up your intake of soluble fiber. Basically has no flavor and is really user-friendly that way.
Quick question for you. I'm going to pop in
Sure.
here. We have a question. What about enriched white bread? Is that any better? We have somebody who's always sort of battling this question out with her husband.
Oh, okay. So enriched bread kind of thing?
Yeah, you know those white breads that say that they've been enriched with
Yes.
like vitamins and things? Yeah.
Yes, so that basically means that it has other ingredients aside from the basic just, bread ingredients like flour and water and salt and yeast. So they kind of help to enrich that dough by providing, whether it's flavors or other benefits. To my knowledge, I don't believe that necessarily means that it has fiber. There are certain types of kind of more white-looking breads that have added fiber, and same thing with like pastas and stuff. I think like the Smart types will have added fiber, but it should specifically say that on the product if it has fiber. Enriched, I think, generally just means that it has some type of nutrient added, but there could be a wide variety of different types that are added for a wide variety of different purposes. So you would need to kind of look at the specific brand and what it is that they've added in that case, because the word enriched can be used fairly broadly to mean that something has been added for some sort of nutritional benefit, but not necessarily fiber. I hope that makes sense.
She said yes and thank you.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so benefits of fiber for heart health. So just to sum up the fiber section of our talk today, fiber does help to improve your cholesterol by reducing the LDL lipoprotein. And if you remember from our previous section with fat, the LDL one is the one that delivers cholesterol to our blood vessels and causes that buildup in plaque. So fiber helps to reduce the level of LDL by actually binding to those cholesterol particles in your body and moving them out of the body so that you don't have an increase of cholesterol in your blood vessels. So it actually helps to remove it, which is a really big bonus. Fiber also improves your blood sugar levels by slowing down the digestion of those carbohydrates, including starch and simple sugars. So once you have the breakdown of those sugars, those carbohydrates in your body, if you've also consumed fiber along with that carbohydrate, essentially if the food that you've eaten also contains fiber, as many foods do, then that actually has a really positive impact on having less of a spike in your blood sugar level. So, if you were to test your blood sugar after having, for example, a glass of orange juice as opposed to an orange, you would see a larger spike in your blood sugar with the glass of orange juice. And the reason behind that is that the whole orange has its own little package of fiber along with the juice inside of it. And so because you're consuming the fiber in addition to that sugary juice that comes in the orange slices, you're having that dampened effect on your blood sugar. Whereas with the orange juice, it has a more immediate effect and a larger effect because in juice, we actually do remove the fiber because we're pressing the fruit and only getting the juice out. So all those fibery parts of the skins and the insides of the fruit are removed. So then we don't have that benefit of dampening our blood sugar spike, and we will see a bigger spike. And the reason why that's relevant to heart health is because over time, prolonged high levels of blood sugars or blood glucose can cause some damage to the inside of our blood vessels, and that can ultimately lead to an increased risk for heart disease. So overall, through these two different mechanisms, by improving cholesterol and improving our blood sugar, fiber plays a really good role in reducing our risk of heart disease. Okay, so lastly, we're going to talk about salt, one of the more popular topics when it comes to heart health, certainly. As we all know, it does play some really significant roles in the health of our heart and our health overall. So I want to start off with a bit of a shocking statistic in terms of the guidelines for sodium. So most of us consume way too much sodium. And if you don't already know, sodium is a portion of salt. So salt is actually made up of sodium chloride. Sodium is part of that chemical structure. So sodium is the one that has the impact. It's not salt as a whole, because the chloride part really, is less important. It's the sodium part of salt that is why we talk about salt so much. So you may hear the two terms used interchangeably, and that's really why. So when we talk about specifically sodium, most healthy adults do actually need some sodium in our diet. It plays a really important role in fluid balance, and it's absolutely necessary for us to consume sodium. The problem is the requirement is about 1,500 milligrams a day, which is, I think, like barely even like less than half of a teaspoon, I believe it is. It's a very, very small amount of sodium or salt. And unfortunately, most Canadians consume 3,400 milligrams a day, which is way, way, way too much. It's quite significantly more than what we need, and it actually becomes detrimental after a certain point. So although we do need, at least 1,500, we certainly don't need 3,400, and it can become problematic when we consume that much sodium. So unfortunately, we have lots of really tasty foods that are high in sodium. Typically, it's your processed types of foods. So sometimes canned and packaged foods, not all canned foods have added sodium, but a lot do. So you can look on the can, oftentimes it will say no sodium added. If that's the case, that's a great choice. But if not, then it probably is fairly high in sodium. So any type of packaged food, keep an eye out for sodium, as there's a good chance it has added salt. Convenience items like frozen dinners, seasoned pasta and rice mixes, stews, pasta sauce, seasoning mixes, frozen pizzas, all those types of convenient things. Baked goods, like things that you actually buy at the bakery, not necessarily that you make at home, because then you have control over how much salt goes in. But when you buy it at the bakery, it's much more likely to have significantly more salt. So things like muffins, breads, and pastries. Then we have our condiments, sauces, and preserves. So of course, our favorite ketchup and mustard, relish, soy sauce, teriyaki, pickles, things like that. Anything that's kind of in a jar is very likely to have a high amount of salt. Then we have processed meats. So these types of sausages or pepperoni or processed hams, prosciutto, things like that are likely to be high in sodium. Processed cheese and cheese spreads. Snack foods like chips, pretzels, popcorn, trail mix, salted nuts. And of course, fast food or restaurant food in general is generally fairly high in sodium, depending, of course, on what you order. Your typical burger and fries are the most likely to be fairly high in sodium. So these are some of the types of foods to look out for. Unfortunately, that encompasses a lot of foods and a lot of very convenient, easy to eat foods that are often time savers. So it can be really challenging to reduce our intake of sodium. And in fact, it's fairly unlikely that any of us would actually be able to decrease our intake all the way down to the 1,500 milligrams that's recommended. It would be very hard in today's society to do that, just because of the sheer amount of sodium that is added to so many of the products that we consume. You would basically have to eat only whole foods, really focus on your fruit and vegetables, but it would be quite challenging to do and also probably quite expensive. So we can certainly work on, limiting these types of foods, but it is a very big challenge in our society today. So we'll talk a little bit about why this is important and the impact that sodium has on your heart health. So as I mentioned, sodium is a mineral that our body does need to maintain normal fluid balance. So it is important. We do need it. We don't want to cut it out completely, but we definitely don't need as much as we get in our day-to-day life. Because too much sodium leads to increased blood pressure. And the reason behind that is fairly simple. Basically, the body will hold on to water to try to dilute the sodium, because your body never wants too concentrated amount of sodium in your body, or that could be quite toxic. So in order to account for that, your body will retain more water and your blood pressure will increase, because if you have more water, you have more blood. So then there's going to be increased pressure put on your blood vessels, which results in increased blood pressure. So that's kind of the science behind how sodium affects our blood pressure. If we then have that increased blood pressure as a result of sodium, we can have damage to our blood vessels, because the pressure that's being put on those blood vessels can cause micro tears, it can cause stiffening of those vessels, and all of those things can lead to increased buildup of plaque on the inside of the vessels. So this can then lead to heart disease and heart attacks, strokes, all of the above, which is obviously something that we're trying to avoid as much as possible. So overall, it looks like my slide got cut off a little bit there, but that's okay. It says diet and heart disease. Just to sum up, I want to just kind of give you an idea of the main ways that a healthy and balanced diet can reduce your risk of heart disease. So the three main important factors are how you can improve your cholesterol levels, how you can reduce your blood pressure, and how you can control your blood sugar. So as we mentioned, the main ways to do that are to follow Canada's food guide, choose unsaturated fat, limit sodium, and I think it fell off the screen there, but also include fiber in your diet as we mentioned today. Okay, So that's pretty well it for me. I would love to answer any other questions that you have. If you have them, I'd be happy to do that. But if not, then thanks so much for taking the time to attend today. I really appreciate it. And my contact info is there as well if you have questions that come up later on.
I'm sure we'll have a few questions, and I'll get it started. First, salt. So I've heard different views on whether things like Himalayan salt is a better option than just your regular table salt. What are your thoughts on that?
Great, yes. Excellent question. The answer is fairly simple, and the answer is no. It is certainly not better. It may be prettier, like pink Himalayan salt, you know, it definitely has its purposes in cooking and in aesthetic, but salt is salt is salt, and it is going to have the same amount of sodium in it because it's made up of sodium chloride, and that chemical structure cannot be changed. So if it's salt, then it's salt. It's pretty simple. So unfortunately, there are very little benefit to consuming those types of salt, except maybe they're prettier and funner to use. Some of them do have maybe additional micronutrients, like vitamins or minerals in them naturally, those types of salts. So I guess you could make an argument that you may be getting some added micronutrients, but it's such a small amount that it's very insignificant. And I think that's what a lot of the companies latch onto, and they try to advertise that they are a healthier option. But in terms of the impact that sodium has, it's no different.
Good, excellent, thank you. See, we just need clarification sometimes because what you see just sort of advertised on social media at times is not necessarily honest.
Yes.
That's what I've found.
Exactly.
If anybody else has any questions, feel free to raise your hand or unmute or put them into the chat. I'll go ahead and ask another one that I had as you were talking about different plant-based foods. This is another one where you sort of hear back and forth information, and that's about soy products. And one of the things that I've heard over the years is that soy can impact estrogen levels in men and women. And so I'm just wondering your thoughts on soy products.
Yes, that's an interesting question. Not really directly related to heart health, but definitely a really popular topic these days. Generally, the evidence that I have kept up on and reviewed suggests that there is really no reason for men or women to stay away from soy products. They can be really great. You know, they're a really great way to have an alternative to dairy for those who are intolerant to it. And they, you know, provide lots of really great nutrients, proteins, etc. So the whole issue with the hormones and the concern around that, soy does have a substance that mimics certain hormones, like estrogen, which I think is where a lot of the concern comes from, but it only mimics it. It isn't the hormone itself, and it has such a minor impact overall. There's been so many studies done on this, and really there's no reason to stay away from it, no matter your gender. Again, just in moderation, right? You know, maybe if you spent every day of your life eating soy products, then maybe you might have something to worry about. But if it's just part of your normal balanced diet, then there's nothing to worry about.
Excellent. We do have a question in the chat. Is there a real benefit of doing intermittent fasting, especially in relation to how that impacts our blood sugars, our blood pressure, which then, of course, impacts our heart health?
Yeah. So intermittent fasting, I could certainly do, you know, an entire presentation just on that topic. It's a really interesting one, and certainly one that they get a lot of questions about these days. I'm not a big fan of any type of restrictive dieting, so, you know, that's my bias. I'll say that, you know, right off the bat. I spent some time working in an eating disorder unit in my internship, and learned a lot of really valuable information there about the really negative impacts that restrictive diets can have, and intermittent fasting certainly falls in that category. I'm a big believer that there's no reason that we should be restricting, whether we're restricting a type of food or the time that we're eating or how much we eat. You know, any of it is still restricting something, and intermittent fasting is more about when we eat, not so much what we eat, but it still is a level of restriction. It places rules around food and controls the way that we eat, and I'm much more of a advocate for, you know, listening to your body and eating when you're hungry, and not restricting and depriving yourself of food when you would prefer to eat. So that's sort of my perspective on it. There are certainly some studies out there that have shown some benefits in certain ways, but personally I try not to encourage it for those reasons.
I hear the passion in your voice as you're talking about it. She says merci. Anybody else before we stop the recording have any last questions or anything else you would like to add? Todd, feel free to. Yep, I'm just going to unmute you, Todd. There you go.
Yeah, thanks. So no, I just wanted to thank Madison for taking the time out and talking to us about this, because yeah, this is, nutrition is always a topic of discussion. I mean, it's on everybody's mind, right? And there's so much conflicting information, whether it's online or from your mom or from your best friend or whatever, right? So it's awesome that we can have a subject matter expert, that a registered dietitian come talk. So I'm really excited that Madison, you took the time for that. I will also note that the presentation on March 4th, so that's your CLS Washington P.Dt. Day, which we've invited all the OCAN community to participate in. So Victoria, Steed, yeah, that's right, Steed?
Stead, yeah.
Stead, okay. Again, from Halifax, we'll be talking about that, and she's going to talk a little bit on intermittent fasting, but if it is a topic like Madison said, I mean, you can talk for an hour just on that alone.
Mm-hmm.
So much information, right? Jump on that one as well. Register for that one on the 4th of April. That's at 10 o'clock Eastern time. Also, a little plug for the OCAN Fitness and Health Initiative for March. So if you haven't registered for it yet, yeah, I just sent it out to the COs yesterday, and I'll put it on my Facebook page today, is the Fruit and Vegetable Challenge. So good segue into that from a nutrition standpoint. That's always a popular one. We're basically just going to get people to track their fruit and vegetable intake for the month of March, trying to get their 4 servings of vegetables and minimum 3 servings of fruit in there. And we encourage you to do it as a team of 4. But if you don't have 4, you just want to do 3, or you just want to do yourself, that's cool as well. So I put the address in the link to the challenge in the chat here, and feel free to send me questions if you have them. But again, thanks, Madison. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, no, not at all. And I just noticed too in the chat that someone is saying that they'd like the slides, so I can certainly send the PDF version or the PowerPoint version along if that's something you're interested in doing, so you can keep them yourself for sure.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Madison. We really appreciate your time, as Todd said. Thank you for presenting to our families, and we look forward to hosting some more health promotion events in the future.
Yes, absolutely.